The 70th week. We talked about week 1 through 69, how that ended with the crucifixion. Christ rides in, his triumphal entry, as prophesied Zechariah 9:9. Then we have Christ's crucifixion. The Messiah is cut off. That is what Daniel refers to as the crucifixion. Messiah is cut off, not for himself. We talked about the gap or the pause in the timeline. How long is this gap or pause? I have no idea, but we talked about some things that are going to happen in that gap or pause, but that that gap or pause was going to eventually end, and it would then begin the 70th week. This week we're going to talk about the 70th week, what happens in that week, only according to the book of Daniel. We'll bring in a few other passages just to give us clarity, but we're not going to go over everything that happens in the 70th week, because I would have to teach the whole book of Revelations, and I am not at this time adequate or able to do that. We're going to talk about 6 or 7 things that are going to happen in the 70th week according to the book of Daniel. We're going to talk about a flood. Daniel mentions a flood. We'll talk about that. Daniel mentions a 1-week covenant or a treaty. And we talked last week, the week. It's not a 7-day week, but we call it a heptad. It's a group of 7 years. So there's a 7-year covenant, a 1-week covenant. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the end of the war, whatever that is. We'll talk about the abomination of desolation, desolation itself, and then the stone, which if you have any idea, our study in Daniel chapter 2, we understand what the stone is already. But we'll look at these aspects of the 70th week according to the book of Daniel. So the first aspect we're going to talk about is the flood. Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27 is where we'll be. Daniel chapter 9, verse number 26. As I mentioned last week, not only is every verse in this chapter important, but every small little phrase in each one of these last verses of Daniel chapter 9 is crucial. They all have huge meaning and huge implications of what is to come. So we're going to break down in Daniel chapter 9, verse number 26, a couple of phrases. So the first one that we're going to look at is going to be about halfway through verse number 26. I'll read number 26 and I'll end with the phrase that we're going to look at. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. We talked about that. But here we see, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Daniel here mentions that the end time, is going to end with a flood. Well, God promised that he wasn't going to flood the earth again, right? Well, not with water. And sometimes people think, oh, well, the earth is going to end with a flood when the Lord floods it with fire and completely consumes the whole earth. That's true, but that doesn't happen until after earth and heaven pass away, and then we have new earth and new heaven, which is at the end of the millennial reign. So what is the flood? What could Daniel be talking about in the flood? And the end thereof shall be with a flood. In order to get the context that we need, we not only have to look at Daniel chapter 9, which talks about the end time, but we're going to look at Christ's teaching in Matthew 24. So let's go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. And we'll go to verse number 37. Matthew 24, verse number 37. If you're there, great. If you're not, I'm going to begin to read. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Christ here is using the days of Noah, the event of the flood, in parallel in his teaching of the end times. All of Matthew chapter 24, Christ is teaching what's going to happen leading up to the end times, what happens during the end times, specifically what happens after the abomination of desolation, which we'll look at. But then he begins to use parables and some parallels in Scripture. Here he's going to use Noah and the flood. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. This parallel is not just a surface level oh, it's going to be a surprise. Christ always uses perfect examples, and he uses his word to confirm his word, if we understand Christ's teaching. We're going to look at some similarities of this event, the flood, and this event, the 70th week. Okay? Similarities, the flood and the tribulation, as in the destruction. The destruction, the tribulation, and the destruction, the flood. Here's some similarities. It's God's judgment on a godless earth. We understand the flood. The only righteous man was Noah and his family. Here in the end times, it talks about perilous times shall come, and there's a huge list in Timothy that talks about how godless the world will be. Not necessarily violent, but just vain. Proud people, they don't need God, they love themselves more than God. It's God's judgment on a godless earth, the flood and the tribulation. The message of destruction will be preached. Noah preached, hey, the floods are coming, the rain's coming, you need to repent, you need to come into the ark. That message is going to be preached. Same thing. If we remember at the end of Christ saying all these things are going to happen before the end time, and the gospel, the message of this kingdom, is going to be preached in the entire world. Just because the message is preached to the entire world doesn't mean the world's going to heed it, but it will be preached to the entire world. So the message of destruction will be preached. Also, it will be a surprise to the unheeding people. Just as the days of Noah, the flood wasn't a surprise to Noah and his family. 7 days before the flood came, Noah was called into the ark. I have a lot of scripture to support it, and we're going to try to go through it. But if you look in scripture, Noah and his family entered into the ark 7 days before the flood came. The flood was not a surprise to Noah and his family. The tribulation to the believer is not going to be a surprise, because we're already going to be in the ark, and we'll look at that next. It was a surprise to the unheeding people. It wasn't until the ark door was closed, the floods came, then they realized, oh, destruction has come. Tribulation is going to be the same way. The believers are going to be gone, and they're not, until the tribulation begins, they're not going to realize, oh, we missed the boat, metaphorically and literally. Here we go, the ark and the rapture. We looked at the tribulation and the flood. Those are times of destruction. We're going to look at the ark and the rapture, similarities. It's God's prepared protection. There's promise after promise after promise of God sparing us from wrath. In 1 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, in Paul's teaching, talks about us being spared from the wrath, and how this day is not going to come as a thief in the night to us. It's not going to be a surprise to us. If you hear teaching or preaching that is mid-tribulation rapture, or somehow post-tribulation rapture, which that really makes no sense. He's going to save us from nothing. It's not scripturally accurate. Every teaching that we see, we have, and every example that we have, even the example of Christ, is the believer is going to be saved from the wrath of God. They're going to go into the ark, a prepared salvation for us. Destruction then comes. The ark and the rapture are pictures of unbreakable, unbreachable salvation. Noah and his family, it was an ark that was designed by God. God closed the door. God kept them safe. It doesn't matter how good of a builder Noah was, that ark was going to last, because God made it last. Our faith, how weak it may be at times, the ark, our salvation, is not dependent on how strong our faith is, because we have very little faith. It's all dependent on God. And when He saves us in the rapture, it is going to be unbreakable and unbreachable. Then the ark returns back to earth after destruction. Again, another beautiful picture of the rapture. If you understand and study how the millennial reign will work, we come back to earth with Christ, and we rule and reign on earth. This earth is a destroyed earth. This is not new heaven and new earth, as promised in the end of Revelations. This is a destroyed earth. The book of Ezekiel and the book of Isaiah both talks about a cleaning and a cleansing process of this earth. There's going to be 7 months of finding bodies and burying bodies. If you have questions on that or passages, I'll share those at the end. It's very interesting. But just as the ark came down to a destroyed earth, but then God made it new through Noah's obedience and through the regeneration of his people, we are going to come back down and reign with Christ on a destroyed earth. So in every way, the ark and the flood is a beautiful picture of the rapture and the tribulation. Daniel says, the end thereof shall be with a flood. And that's the best picture that we can see. The end thereof will be with a flood. We're going to look at another aspect. A covenant. A covenant is going to be made. Daniel 9:27. You can either flip back there or just read it here. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Who's he here talking about? God? A man? It's going to be the Antichrist. It's going to be the prince of this world, the one that is going to be elevated into a position of power. Eventually, he's going to be the only power on earth at the time after the halfway point. But he's going to make a covenant, a treaty for 1 week. Again, that week is not a 7-day period. It's a 7-year period. This covenant, this treaty is vital. It is just a small phrase in Daniel 9, verse number 27, but the timeline that's laid out in Revelations, your 1,260 days to halfway, then 1,260 days afterwards, everything that begins in Revelation all begins with the signing of this treaty, very specifically. Later we'll see that in the midst of this treaty, it will be the abomination of desolation. And again, more timelines stem off of that. But the believer will not be here, either immediately right before this occurrence or for a small period before that. We talked about Noah entering the ark 7 days before the flood. That may be a possibility where the believer is raptured out and there's a small time period before this treaty is signed. Or this treaty is signed, we're up and out, and then the tribulation begins. Either way, this treaty begins the 7-year clock. It will be 7 years from the signing of this treaty to Christ's second coming to earth in the Battle of Armageddon. That's the fact. So the covenant. So far we looked at, just this brief overview, brief review. Talked about the end thereof will be with a flood. That's talking about the tribulation. There's a 1-week covenant, and that specific time begins our 7-year timeline. Now we're going to look at something, the end of the war, and it's going to set up desolations. If you're in Daniel, it's going to be Daniel chapter 9, verse number 26. We're kind of going, not backwards, but Daniel 9, verse number 26. We'll go right halfway through the verse. It says, the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So there's a specific time, desolations, that are determined at the end of this war. What is this war? What is the time of this war? And it's not the end of wars, the end of all wars. It's the end of a specific war. So you see in this, we got about 3.5 years from the covenant begins, and then at the end of the war. Is it a world war that occurs in this time period? That's a thought. Is it some other kind of war? What is it? The answer for this question is going to be in Revelations chapter 12. I urge you to flip forward to Revelations chapter 12. Here in Revelations chapter 12, this is a metaphorical chapter and a deep chapter, but it's very easy to understand. It talks about a woman, and this woman bears a child, a man-child, and there's a red dragon that is waiting for this child to be born. That red dragon is Satan. He's waiting for this child to be born, and after the child is born, he tries to consume this child, but before he can do that, it's caught up to God. We understand that as Christ, the man-child. The woman would then be a religious group or a religious people group, the Jews or God's people. Here it's God's people is this religious group. It's the woman. And Christ is born. And that Satan tries to overcome Christ, and he can't. And he's taken up to God. But then in verse number 7, we see something happens. Verse number 7. Revelation chapter 12. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place any more in heaven. There's a war in heaven. I don't even think this is metaphorical. I think this is going to be a literal war. Satan and his angels are going to make a final attempt to overcome the kingdom of heaven through force. Michael and his angels will fight against Satan. How do we know the time of this war? If we continue to read chapter 12, we're going to skip through a few verses, but we're going to see something happens, and it will give us the exact time of when this war is. Okay, verse number 9. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceived the whole world, and he was cast into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Satan and his angels are cast out of heaven. Well, was this the fall of Lucifer? No. This isn't the fall of Lucifer, because this comes after Christ is born, caught up to heaven. When does this happen? Let's go down, all the way down to verse number 17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God. They're cast out of heaven. Oh, sorry, we need to go to verse number 14. I skipped over that. Verse number 14. And the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. Here, God's people, they're hiding in the wilderness for a time and times and a half a time. So 3.5 times, 3.5 years. When Satan is cast out of heaven, this time when he is defeated, he goes down to earth, and he then begins to, he was wroth with the woman. He was wroth at God. He was mad that he could not overtake heaven. So he goes on earth and unleashes his anger on the remnant of the woman's seed. So the remainder of people that believe in Christ. This happens at the halfway point. Daniel refers to this in Daniel 12, verse number 1. It says, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for thy people. Let's go back to Daniel. We're going to continue to read that verse. Daniel chapter 12. I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to see it for yourself. Daniel 12, verse number 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. What happens after Michael stands up? And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. Here is talking about a time of tribulation that is going to be like unother. Christ talks about this in Matthew 24. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation as spoken by the prophet Daniel, he that readeth understandeth, he says, run as far as you can, as fast as you can. Pray that your flight's not in winter or on the Sabbath. He says, get out of there. And woe to any mother that has a child in this time, because it is going to be a time which Christ calls of great tribulation. That begins after the war is ended, and it begins after this abomination of desolation. Here's another thing that we're going to talk about, the abomination of desolation. Now, haste. Abomination of desolation, we talked about Antiochus Epiphanes when he came in with the Greek Empire. He goes into the temple. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. He sets up an image of himself to be worshipped. He forces the priests to eat swine, which was forbidden in Jewish law. He pours the broth of the swine all over the sacred text, and he makes desolate for 2,300 days Jerusalem and the temple. This abomination of desolation is not what's talked about here at the end times. It's another abomination that's going to be set up. The Antichrist is going to come, and he's going to do the same thing. He's going to come into the temple of God. He's going to declare himself as God. He's going to cut off the daily sacrifice that's mentioned in Daniel 9, verse number 27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week shall he cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. For the overspreading of abominations shall he make it desolate, even unto the consummation, so even unto the end. And that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. So here, halfway through, we have this abomination of desolation. In the midst or the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. In the same manner, it's a picture. What Antiochus did is a picture of what was going to happen, except for it's going to be the Antichrist that does it this time. What is desolations? After this halfway point, after the end of war, there's desolations. After this abomination, there's desolations. What is desolations? It's just utter destruction, like never seen before. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. Revelations 12:17, we already read that. And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Here is one of many verses in Revelations that relates to, this is not just God's people that are going to go through this. This is anybody that has chose to keep the commandments of God and to have the testimony of Jesus Christ. There will be millions of people that will be saved during the tribulation. Complete side note. Millions. I have, at the end, I have a couple of verses that you can look at and study yourself. John sees souls more than he can count. And he counted 10,000 times 10,000 angels and thousands of thousands. So there's going to be millions of people, not Jews, all types of people, nations, tongues, languages that will accept Christ. They'll keep the commandments of God and they'll have the testimony of Jesus Christ, and Satan personally will attack those people. This is desolations. But then finally we have the stone, that end. The best part of the story, I think, the stone. This is referring to Daniel chapter 2, verse number 34, when Nebuchadnezzar has his dream of the statue, and we looked at all of those, the imagery of the different levels, the five kingdoms that are going to be set up. But then finally, this happens. Thou sawest till a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon the feet, and that were of iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. So that last empire, that's iron and clay, the stone, Jesus Christ comes. He strikes the image, destroys all nations that were there. And he rules with a rod of iron for 1,000 years until all enemies are put under his feet. And like the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, he'll rule till he puts all enemies under his feet. And the last enemy that is defeated is death. And he defeats that at the end of the millennial reign. So there's the stone that destroys. The 70th week, according to Daniel, what's going to happen? There's going to be a flood. The ark is going to save God's people. There's going to be utter destruction. But then the ark will come back down. There's going to be a 1-week covenant, which begins the timeline of that 70th week. There's going to be the end of the war in heaven. Satan is no longer allowed access into heaven. He and all of his angels are kicked out for the final time. But then he is given the key to the bottomless pit. He loosens just absolute chaos on earth. And it begins, after the abomination of desolation, it begins desolations themselves. Then we have the stone, Jesus Christ, that comes to earth and puts all enemies under his feet and rules for 1,000 years.